The Office of Budget Responsibility is going to slash its growth forecast, we hear. Some say by as much as a half. You have no fiscal headroom left. Just how serious is the country's financial situation?
I'm not going to preempt the Office of Budget Responsibility's forecast, but the world has changed. We can all see that before our eyes. And government are not inactive in that. We'll respond to the change and continue to meet our fiscal rules, but we're also shaping the new world, whether that's in the defence and security realm.
In a recent interview on Trevor Phillips' show, Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor of the Labour Party, was put under intense scrutiny regarding her stance on the country's economic challenges. The discussion quickly turned to the government's decision to raise taxes, a move that has sparked considerable controversy, particularly amid the ongoing cost of living crisis. Reeves was asked whether she believed tax increases had a negative impact on the economy, a question that prompted a confident yet somewhat defensive response. She argued that, in the face of unprecedented global challenges such as the Russian aggression and the ongoing strain on the public health system, the Labour Party's fiscal decisions were necessary for the country's stability. In her view, raising taxes and redirecting funds from overseas aid into defence spending was a responsible move, one that allowed the government to bolster national security and public services without undermining the economy. She painted a picture of a Labour government acting pragmatically to ensure public finances remained on solid ground, avoiding the need to raid critical public service budgets. However, her dismissal of the impact of these decisions raised eyebrows, particularly when she casually mentioned that these funds were not additional money, but rather money redirected from international development aid. Her attempts to justify the reallocation of funds were met with skepticism. Critics quickly pointed out that the money was not additional but essentially taken away from other crucial services, and this did not necessarily equate to economic recovery. The public's reaction was less than favorable, as many saw her statement as a failure to acknowledge the real impact of these changes on the nation's most vulnerable. Rachel Reeves' defense of these policies continued with the argument that without these difficult decisions, the UK would not have had the financial capacity to face the ongoing threats or improve public services. While her rationale may have seemed logical from a governmental perspective, the average person struggling to pay bills or maintain a standard of living was likely to view her words with frustration. They questioned whether the government's fiscal approach truly benefited them or whether it was merely an exercise in managing finances at the expense of critical social programs. The reassurances provided by Reeves did little to convince those feeling the economic squeeze. The economy may have shown signs of growth on paper, but for the millions grappling with rising costs and stagnant wages, her words seemed detached from their lived reality. Despite the well-intentioned defense of the government's policies, it became evident that Reeves' position reflected a growing disconnect between Labour's leadership and the everyday struggles of the British public. The interview highlighted the party's failure to offer substantive solutions to the economic crisis, leaving the public to wonder whether Labour truly understood the magnitude of the challenges they faced. During her recent appearance on Trevor Phillips' show, Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor of the Labour Party, found herself defending the government's handling of the nation's financial situation, particularly when it came to the controversial issue of tax increases. As the discussion progressed, Reeves was confronted with tough questions about the growing financial strain on households and the impact of rising costs on living standards. At the heart of the debate was the recent report from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which predicted a sharp decline in living standards over the next 5 years. According to the foundation's research, many of the poorest households in the UK would be hit hardest by inflation, stagnant wages, and growing poverty levels. However, Reeves was quick to reject the report's findings, confidently asserting that living standards would in fact improve under the current government. She argued that the UK was on the path to recovery, with wages rising faster than inflation and inflation itself slowing down. This assertion, however, was met with immediate backlash. Many critics, particularly those struggling with the rising cost of food, energy, and housing, found her comments out of touch with the reality they were facing. For them, the rising wages touted by Reeves were still insufficient to offset the sharp increase in essential living costs. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation's report painted a much darker picture, one that seemed more aligned with the lived experiences of the many families who were feeling the full brunt of inflation. As Reeves continued to defend the government's stance, her optimism seemed increasingly disconnected from the hardships that people across the country were enduring. The more she insisted that things were improving, the more the public's frustration grew. Many began to wonder whether her positive rhetoric was simply a politically convenient narrative, one that ignored the dire economic reality that many were facing on a daily basis. Despite the evidence presented by experts, Reeves remained firm in her belief that the economy was improving, and she focused on presenting the government's fiscal decisions as prudent and necessary, even in the face of criticism. This unwavering optimism, however, failed to resonate with the electorate. For many, it appeared as if the government was failing to adequately address the economic issues that were most pressing to them. While her claims about rising wages and falling inflation might have been valid on a surface level, they didn't capture the full picture. Families were still struggling with high energy bills, rent, and the cost of basic necessities. The gap between what Reeves was claiming and what people were experiencing on the ground seemed to widen with each passing day. This growing disconnect not only raised doubts about Reeves' grasp on the situation, but also about the Labour Party's ability to effectively address the most urgent economic challenges facing the nation. As the situation unfolded, it became increasingly clear that the government's failure to acknowledge the lived realities of millions was only deepening the sense of disillusionment among the British public. Rachel Reeves' interview on Trevor Phillips' show continued to raise eyebrows as her confident dismissal of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's alarming report on falling living standards drew widespread criticism. While Reeves insisted that the economy was improving and that wages were rising faster than inflation, the harsh reality for many British families painted a very different picture. Despite her claims of economic recovery, millions of households were still struggling to make ends meet, as the cost of living continued to skyrocket, far outpacing any wage gains. The Foundation's report had predicted a sharp decline in living standards, particularly for the UK's poorest, as inflation eroded real incomes, making it increasingly difficult for families to afford basic necessities. However, Reeves remained insistent that the government's policies were leading to a brighter future, arguing that wages were rising and inflation was slowing down. Her narrative, however, failed to acknowledge the dire circumstances many people were enduring, and her claims seemed increasingly out of touch with the reality faced by working-class families. The public, already feeling the strain of rising energy prices, housing costs and food bills, could not relate to the optimistic projections put forth by Reeves. While her arguments were based on broader economic figures and projections, these did little to reflect the immediate financial pain that families were facing. For many, the reality of stagnant wages, combined with struggling to keep up with the escalating cost of living. As inflation remained stubbornly high, even modest wage increases were insufficient to offset the increased costs of everyday goods. For households already on the edge, this created a deep sense of financial insecurity and frustration, making Reeves' message seem more like an attempt to divert attention from the pressing issues at hand. Her focus on broader economic indicators, while valid in certain contexts, missed the mark for those who were directly impacted by the cost of living crisis. The disconnect between Reeves' confident claims and the lived experiences of millions of families only deepened the growing sense of frustration among the public. Rather than offering tangible solutions to address the root causes of the crisis, she continued to defend the government's policies, presenting them as necessary steps for long-term economic stability. Yet, for many, the immediate pain they were experiencing made such reassurances feel hollow and irrelevant. The more Reeves insisted that things were improving, the more she seemed to be disregarding the very real financial challenges faced by those who were struggling to get by. This growing divide between the government's narrative and the reality faced by ordinary citizens raised important questions about Labour's ability to effectively address the nation's economic woes. With public trust in the government waning, the Labour Party's failure to connect with the electorate on such critical issues was becoming an increasingly significant concern for its future. Rachel Reeves' refusal to engage with the economic realities faced by millions of Britons during her interview only deepened the growing sense of disillusionment among the public. As the Shadow Chancellor confidently dismissed the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's warnings about the declining living standards, her position began to appear more out of touch with the struggles that so many were enduring. The Foundation's report painted a grim picture, predicting that the poorest households would suffer the most in the coming years, with living standards dropping as inflation continued to outpace wage growth. However, Reeves' dismissal of these findings in favor of an optimistic narrative of economic recovery led many to question whether she truly understood the depth of the crisis. She insisted that living standards would improve and wages were rising faster than inflation, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. For many families, the wage increases she cited were nowhere near enough to keep pace with the soaring cost of living. Even as inflation slowed slightly, it remained high enough to outstrip the modest gains in wages, leaving families struggling to afford the basics, such as food, energy, and housing. Reeves' insistence that things were getting better felt increasingly hollow as the daily reality of rising costs continued to weigh heavily on households. For those already grappling with rising energy bills, stagnant wages, and increasing housing costs, the promises of future economic prosperity seemed far removed from their immediate concerns. The dissonance between the optimistic projections of Labour's leadership and the harsh experiences of everyday people was becoming harder to ignore. As the government continued to downplay the severity of the situation, public frustration grew, with many questioning whether Labour was still in touch with the challenges facing the working class. This growing disconnect between the leadership's narrative and the lived experiences of millions only further alienated the electorate. By failing to acknowledge the real impact of the cost of living crisis on families, Reeves and Labour risked undermining their credibility and their ability to connect with voters. The public was no longer interested in abstract economic projections that promised future improvement. They wanted immediate, tangible solutions to the pressing issues they faced every day. As Labour's leadership continued to push their narrative of recovery, the gap between their rhetoric and the reality of the situation only widened, leaving many to wonder whether the party could truly be trusted to address the country's economic challenges. The failure to connect with the electorate on such an essential issue had the potential to cost Labour dearly in the future, particularly as the next election loomed ever closer. Rachel Reeves' interview on Trevor Phillips' show revealed the widening gap between the Labour Party's leadership and the realities faced by millions of British families. As Shadow Chancellor, Reeves found herself in a precarious position, defending her government's economic policies amid growing concerns about the cost of living crisis. When confronted with expert reports like the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's prediction of a significant drop in living standards, she dismissed these warnings with a level of optimism that many found out of touch. The foundation had highlighted that the poorest households would bear the brunt of the economic fallout, with inflation continuing to erode their purchasing power while wages stagnated. Despite these stark projections, Reeves remained firm in her belief that the economy was improving. She claimed that wages were rising faster than inflation, and that living standards would improve during the course of the current parliament. However, for many, this assertion felt disconnected from the harsh realities they faced daily. Inflation, despite slowing somewhat, remained stubbornly high, and wages, though rising, could not keep up with the spiraling costs of essentials like food, energy, and housing. For working families already struggling to make ends meet, the optimistic claims made by Reeves were little more than empty rhetoric. Her failure to acknowledge the financial strain faced by millions only deepened the perception that Labour's leadership was out of touch. While Reeves continued to push her narrative of economic recovery, the public's frustration mounted. Many saw her comments as dismissive of the very real challenges they were confronting. For households living paycheck to paycheck, the idea that living standards were improving seemed like a distant dream. Reeves' focus on wage increases while ignoring the fact that these gains were insufficient to cover the rising cost of living left many questioning whether she truly understood the struggles of the working class. Critics were quick to point out the contradiction between Reeves's optimistic projections and the lived reality of most households. How could the government claim progress when families were seeing their real incomes shrink, with wages failing to match the pace of rising prices? The lack of concrete solutions to address the widening gap between wages and inflation made it clear that Labour's economic strategy was not resonating with the people who needed it most. At the same time, the government's reluctance to address the immediate concerns of working families left many wondering if Labour had lost touch with its roots. Once a party that prided itself on representing the working class, Labour now seemed more focused on maintaining its narrative of recovery than on providing practical solutions to the problems that voters were facing every day. As the cost of living continued to outpace wage growth, the political consequences for Labour seemed inevitable. The gap between the party's leadership and the electorate's needs continued to widen, leaving many questioning whether Labour could truly be trusted to lead the country through its current economic crisis. With each passing day, the disconnect between Labour's promises and the reality on the ground became more apparent, and the pressure on Reeves and her colleagues to offer meaningful change grew ever greater. As the Labour Party grapples with a growing internal and public crisis, Rachel Reeves' leadership is being increasingly questioned. Despite her repeated assertions that the economy is improving under Labour's guidance, her comments seem to be falling on deaf ears, particularly among the working-class families she claims to represent. The political fallout from her recent interview with Trevor Phillips only intensified the party's vulnerabilities. Critics argue that her refusal to acknowledge the gravity of the ongoing cost of living crisis is not just a failure of policy but a deeper disconnect between Labour's leadership and the electorate. In her interview, Reeves touted optimistic projections about wage growth and inflation, yet ignored the very real hardships facing millions of families. This lack of understanding about the economic reality that so many people endure was met with increasing skepticism from the public, leaving Reeves and Labour's credibility at an all-time low. The party's inability to offer substantial solutions to the financial struggles of ordinary people has fueled a growing perception that they are out of touch with those who need leadership the most. Moreover, with rising council taxes and a broken promise to freeze them, the party's credibility has been further undermined. For many, these tax increases felt like a betrayal, exacerbating their financial burden. Labour's inability to provide practical relief in the face of such challenges is leaving its supporters disillusioned and skeptical of the party's ability to lead. As the crisis continues to deepen, Labour's prospects for the upcoming election remain uncertain, with the public growing increasingly disenchanted by their failure to address the most pressing issues facing the country today. See you later.